New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Well, hello there. I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thoughts, Roots and Branches. And we have been looking at the history of the ideas and the teachings that are now known as New Thought. And when we started, we looked way back into history. And then we slowly moved forward up through the Enlightenment, into the Transcendentalists, and into the early teachers here in this country, and all the way through to now we're talking about the guys and the gals that were really making a difference in the 20th century. And today, many of you will probably know more about this guy than I do, but I know some details that might be fun to know. Today, we're going to be talking about Ernest Holmes. Ernest Holmes, the founder of religious science and the author of Science of Mind. Now, if we look at the next slide, we see that on the tree of possible folks in New Thought, he is, well, that's interesting that the little rectangle shifted when I wasn't looking, but there he is down there near the bottom in the lower corner there. And if you go down to the next slide, you will see him in almost exactly the same position, a little higher up, because there are more modern teachers after him in this particular version. Now, Ernest Holmes was very young when he first encountered this material. And so we're going to see a wider range of pictures of him than of other people. Also, he was working in the 20th century. So in the next slide, we will see him in his very early 20s, up there in the corner, trying to look intensely metaphysical. It's almost a laughable picture. Kind of relates to Houdini, I think, who was very popular during much of Holmes's lifetime. And then we get his middle years, his 30s and 40s there right below that. Then we get his 50s and 60s. And then we get the official one after he'd been granted the Doctor of Divinity degrees by a couple of colleges in other countries besides the US. And finally, toward the end there, he was sitting in his garden there in the Los Angeles area in his final years. So, yep, Ernest Holmes has been very active in this field for a very long time. As we go into the next slide, we learn a little bit about how that all began. He and his 8 brothers, there were 9 of them, were born in a rural area outside of Lincoln, Maine in 1867. He was the younger one of them. And his experience as that child, I'm sorry, 80, I said 67, I meant 87, forgive me. It happens, yes, 1887. So he wasn't involved in that Civil War period. He was actually a child of the gay 90s, but in an area that had no experience of the gay 90s. He was off in that rural area of Maine, and they were so poor, so very poor, that the guys were having to share things in order to get through. And the household owned 2 books. Well, if you grew up in New England, there was a Bible in the house. that was going to happen anyway. But somehow, and I have no idea how, they also got hold of Henry Drummond's book, Natural Law in the Spiritual World. And Henry Drummond was a Moody evangelist, okay, Thomas Moody Bibles, and he was working in the wharfs in Scotland, right, during the weekends. On the weekdays, Henry Drummond was a natural history professor. So this book was his integration of evangelical Christianity and natural history. I actually took the book and did some work with it because it is so seminal to Ernest Holmes' ideas. So I called my version of it One Law, because what Drummond was trying to help us get, and what apparently Ernest grew up understanding, was that who we are a part of a spiritual system that is only temporarily material, and where the material is reinforcing itself, evolving into becoming more fully spiritual. So that was the household in which this young boy grew up. And then he left school at 15. He got to Boston actually at the age of 16. He apprenticed himself to a butcher and was able to support himself working in the butcher shop while he attended the Leland Powers School of Expression. He was there to study elocution. This young man, growing up in a rural New England environment, set his sights on being a major world speaker in his teens. Now, what's interesting about being in Boston in 1908 to 1910 is he was there for the last couple of years that Mary Baker Eddy was on the planet, and she was working in those last couple of years. So he actually, in his listening to various wonderful speakers, had the opportunity to hear Mary Baker Eddy talk about Christian Science, which woke up an interest in him that never ended in the rest of his life. The interest in the possibility that what we think and say can change our lives and the lives of others. As we look in the next slide, we see that he completed that training in Boston, and the next year he went out to join his brother Fenwick. And if you listen to my show on the Holmes brothers, who made their own contribution as a pair, he was working with Fenwick, who was being a minister in Venice, California. He took a job with the city government in order to support himself, and he and Fenwick ran the local Boy Scout troops, and they were studying together. And they were studying, originally they studied the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then they discovered the work of both William Walker Atkinson and Christian Larson. In fact, they took a correspondence study course with Christian Larson. And toward the end of that period, they found themselves in the Los Angeles Metaphysical Library. And on one of the end tables was a very small orange book that was called The Edinburgh Lectures. And this is Thomas Troward. And they began to see that not only were people having these experiences, and not only were those experiences documented and documentable, but there was a body of theory to help us understand it. And that was a turning point for the young Ernest Holmes, because in 1917, he was just turning 30. Well, that same year, being both minister and head of the Boy Scouts, Ernest and Fenwick took on the city of Venice and, frankly, the county of Los Angeles, and a whole lot of very, very interested parties to prevent the idea of professional boxing from entering into Venice, California, and they won. So they had a success, a lot of successes, really, for this young man who was absolutely determined to find out how it is that words and thoughts can heal. So in the next slide, we see that he had been visiting that library, and then he was invited to come speak. Well, he's an elocutionist, right? I'm sure, even in polite conversation, that he was quite clear and quite interesting, right? So he went ahead and gave a few lectures there, which then led to a nationwide tour that ended up in the INTA meeting on the East Coast of 1918. Now, this is the INTA, International New Thought Alliance, very early. They started in 1914. And this one, Emma Curtis Hopkins, was the official president of the conference, and Nona Brooks from Denver, Colorado, was attending. And in this series of sessions in that conference, Ernest Holmes made it a point to interview everybody who was an effective practitioner to learn more about what works and how. And this is the meeting where he approached Nona Brooks, listened to her in her classes, listened to her doing her treatments. And he went up to her afterwards and he says, I think I know your secret. And she says, oh, really? And he says, omnipresence. You know without a doubt that the good, the health, the well-being is omnipresent, present everywhere. And she acknowledged that. Now, omnipresence is Nona Brooks' signature. He attempted to interview Emma Curtis Hopkins. She had a rather full schedule, and she said no. However, at the end of this meeting, he was able to write his first book, The Creative Mind. And it did pretty well. Both, as you may recall in that talk that I did on the Holmes brothers, both Fenwick and Ernest were very much aware that if you have little booklets and little brochures for sale, that people are more likely to actually remember what it was you said in the lecture, and they help support the tour. So in the next few years, he went back to California. He published the book in California in 1919. And he and his brother set up this home in Long Beach, California. And I have been by the building. It's not that home anymore. But it was a place where people who were receiving mental treatments could be cared for. And that was what they focused on for the next few years as they built up their reputation, both of them. And together they toured the New England and New York area again in 1924 to 25, and again attended an International New Thought Alliance. And this time in 1924, October of 24, Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was in New York for the last time in her life on the planet, granted the interview. And not only did she let him have an interview, in the first hour they were together, she gave him an overview of lesson 1 of her teachings. And he describes her beautifully. He says she was elegant and stately, wearing a marvelous gown from the last century and a hat with her snow white hair and violet eyes. You can just see all of that in the room in the Oriental Hotel where she met him. And she said, well, that's sufficient for today. Shall we meet again tomorrow? And tomorrow and tomorrow. So for the next 12 days, the better part of 2 weeks, she does take Sunday off, so effectively 2 weeks, she took him through her 12 lessons that go from zero, I think I may know something about God and Christ and all that good stuff, to powerful, world-transforming healer. That's what those 12 lessons are designed to do. We went over them when we talked about Emma. And what happened when that was done, Ernest contacted his brother and said, Fenwick, I know you were drafting a book called The Science of Mind, but I must use that title. And Fenwick, being a very good older brother, said, well, of course. And as we look in the next slide, we see that the book, The Science of Mind, came out. Its original draft was only a small book like all these others, The Science of Mind, and it came out in 1925. That time with Emma was when he crystallized all of this teaching and exploring he'd been doing all along. And out of The Creative Mind, we see that he wrote a couple of other books, The Creative Mind and Success, Discover a Richer Life, and Living Without Fear. As he went into The Science of Mind, he began a whole new way of thinking, and these are some of the ones. Now, I had read this thing called You, and then I'd found this thing called Life. Well, The Art of Life is the new title if you've been looking for this thing called Life. It isn't there anymore. It is The Art of Life. And this last one, it's up to you, the nature and experience of your life. So these are, like many people who teach, these are lectures and sermons and thoughts and articles that have been woven together into books, and they're very coherent. And frankly, if you have a friend who wants to try to understand what New Thought and Science of Mind are all about, give them this thing called You. It's probably the simplest, easiest, clearest assessment and introduction to the field that there is. While the Science of Mind, on the other hand, became the fundamental text for thousands of people. And so we see in the next slide what happened in the years following that. When the book was published, he was still on the East Coast, and he proceeded to lecture from it and sell it all over the East Coast. And in 1926, he returned back to LA, and he rented a theater, the Ambassador Hotel Theater, that seated 625 people. Now, he had built up a reputation, remember, in that period before 1924, he and Fenwick both, and he had been pretty well received as a speaker. Also be aware, in 1910, 1920, 1930, a few people had radios. Nobody had televisions, and going to listen to a lecture was a major source of entertainment. So a lot more people were attending things like this in those days. Well, in 1927, when he turned 40, he doubled the size of his audience at the Abel Theater, and he got married. He married Hazel Durkee Foster. Now, she was a socialite and had a fair amount of resources. And so they had a beautiful, beautiful home in the hills with a marvelous rose garden, which gave him great joy. And they loved to entertain. Hazel loved his work. She was his #1 supporter. And she was delighted to entertain all the wonderful people who were attracted to Ernest's teachings there in the 20s in Los Angeles. Oh, remember Hollywood in Los Angeles on the edge of? Well, there were a lot of Hollywood folks attracted to what it was that Ernest Holmes was teaching. Well, there were enough of them that he incorporated the Institute of Religious Science and School of Philosophy in that same year. It was quite a year when he turned 40. And he began to publish what became the Science of Mind magazine, which includes articles and daily inspirations. Later, that institute was changed into the Institute of Religious Science and Philosophy. So it wasn't a separate school of teaching philosophy. It was all about the research and the teaching of this idea of religious science. And then almost 20 years later, enough of his students had gone out in the world to say, we want a church. Now, this is not the first time you've heard me say this. His students returned and said, we want a church. This is what happened to the Fillmores. This is what happened to Mary Baker Eddy. It's what happened to the Brooks sisters. Once people start learning these ideas, they can't do regular church anymore, because the kinds of ideas that are the doctrine of any of the traditional, the 8 mainstream religions that are the external doctrine, excuse me for that, can't do that. It no longer makes sense. It doesn't work, because you're actually contradicting yourself in the church service. So 1954, they finally convinced him. They'd been asking him for years, like 10, 12 years, finally convinced him, and he formed the Church of Religious Science. So the church, however, was still lectures in hotel rooms and ballrooms and theaters. And it also was people coming for treatments and classes at the offices of the Institute there in LA. Now, in order for people to have a consistent set of teachings, Ernest had to put together a set of core concepts. So in the next slide, we see the beginning of the 10 core concepts that define this institution of religious science. And the fundamental one is oneness. Now, remember that when he was listening to Nona Brooks, he got that there is omnipresence of good. And that is the part of what led to this understanding that it's all one. God is the source of all that is. God is all that is. All right. In most exoteric or culturally defined churches, God is somewhere out there, not in religious science and not in New Thought anywhere. God is all that is. Everything in the universe is made of the God substance. And everything, every person is a unique, individualized expression of what we call God. Yes, that's the foundation. You get that one, almost everything else is easy. But the next one addresses a culture that says, but it's a Trinity. And he says that there is a triune nature of the one God. 3 aspects that he calls spirit, soul, and body. And we all have spirit, soul, and body. God as the macrocosm, spirit, soul, and body, and each of us as the microcosm. He went on and says, this godness, this beingness, this soul, mind, body, soul, spirit, body being is always creative. He got that one from Thomas Troward, who calls God the creative process and says his book, in the book, Creative Process in the Individual, that this is what is meant by we are created in the image of the Creator. We are the creative process. So number 3, God thinks and the world comes into being. Likewise, all human accomplishments originate in thought. Our human thinking process is the microcosm of the macrocosm. So you can see where Thomas Troward's ideas were affecting him very early on in his concepts. Thank you. In the next slide, we're looking at numbers 4 and 5. So he introduces something called prayer. All right. And what he's been calling God, here he calls all good. This is directly derived from Emma Curtis Hopkins. She defines God as the omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient good, right? So all good is eternally available and ready to flow into human experience. And we activate this flow by means of prayer. Now, I'm going to modify that just a little tiny little bit and say we activate our awareness of the flow that is constantly happening. Omnipresence is also continual. It is never not happening. So as we enter the prayer state, we activate our awareness of this constant flow. And then he says, through a affirmative prayer or spiritual mind treatment, we increase our consciousness, our awareness of good eternally flowing to us. Now, affirmative prayer is from the Fillmores. That's what they called what they did. But he introduced this term of spiritual mind treatment. It's also slightly modified from something that Hopkins had been saying. Number 5, wholeness. It's all one, right? This is going, if in modern science, we're talking about fractals here, but here, spirit is a transcendent, perfect whole that contains and embraces all seeming opposites. This is Hopkins' lesson 12, transcendent. We are transcendent beings, right? So if we go in, as human beings, we have free will and can choose what we experience, whether it be positive or negative. Now, positive or negative here is whether it is contributing to our sense of well-being or not. Okay, we may choose in the direction of distress because of a history of drama or because we don't know better, right? We have always chosen in that direction. We don't realize we could be choosing something that is beneficial and supportive of our sense of well-being. The next sentence, the same principle that brings us freedom, prosperity, and joy also allows us to experience bondage, lack, or misery according to our consciousness. And that ties right back to Emily Cady's first lesson: slavery or bondage or freedom. Bondage or freedom, which, right? In the next slide, we get to see his sixth concept, and seventh, abundance. All that anyone will ever need or desire is already provided by universal abundance. I mean, how can you look at a tree or the life in an ocean or the microorganisms in a glass of water and not realize, or the stars in the heaven and not realize that this is an abundant universe? There's always so much. Every tree produces so many seeds, not just one, millions of seeds sometimes, certainly hundreds and thousands. Wow. Because it's not just about the tree. It's about the tree in a world of abundance and many beings working together to sustain that tree and sustain themselves and the tree working with them and all of that. So we live in a universe of abundance. And he says in the next sentence of that point, this applies to everybody, not just some people. Every person is heirs to the riches of creation without regard to merit. Wow. Really? And that notion of heir to the riches, that comes from Paul, the Apostle Paul. In one of his letters, he says that we are all heirs, co-heirs with Christ to the riches of the all that is, of the heaven, if you will. All right, so the seventh point is the reciprocal universe. And it's interesting because I've been doing some treatments with folks today, and almost every one of them, it's been about the mirror that the universe is. So here we go. For every visible form, there is an invisible counterpart. This means that what we receive corresponds to what we imagine and believe we can receive. And he calls that the law of mental equivalence. This also is the golden rule that what we do to others will be done also to us, the law of cause and effect. So the idea of mental equivalence actually is from Emmett Fox. He's the one who suggests forming mental equivalence. So here again, we've got this marvelous student of all these practitioners and teachers weaving it together into a set of core concepts that has become the foundation for what are now called the Centers for Spiritual Living. So what we receive corresponds to what we imagine and believe we can receive. And that, of course, is from the quote from the New Testament, Jesus saying, "It shall be as you believe." Yes? And in the next slide, we get the next two core concepts. Number 8, forgiveness. Now, almost everyone who has ever taught anything in the New Thought tradition encourages the idea of forgiveness, and they all have slightly different versions of it. It's lesson 3 in the Emma Hopkins work, and she calls forgiveness giving forness. We're giving something up and receiving something in return. So Holmes says, in the eternal now, there can be no place for divine anger, unforgiveness, or punishment. If we perceive a need for forgiveness, this is a human condition. Human forgiveness is the process that frees us to live in the eternal now. Just be fully present here and now, because I've let go of any of that other stuff. It's irrelevant. Let's be in now. And now is an eternal moment. All time and space is happening right now. Yes? He says it's the essential step, forgiveness, is the essential step before real spiritual growth can flourish. Science of Mind teaches that the ultimate goal of life is complete emancipation from all discord of every nature. Bondage or freedom, which? When we enter into that state where we totally release and let go of whatever's happened in our life before, we can be fully free in the present moment, free to love, free to appreciate, free to enjoy what is now, because we're not hanging on to any regrets or upsets or angers from the past. Marvelous. His ninth concept, immortality. Many New Thought teachers were absolutely convinced of this, and biologically, they have every reason to do so. Let's look at what he says. The universal truth about life is that it never ends. What we call death is simply the changing of one form of life for another. The belief and perception that life must come to an end, called death, is a human concept. As in birth, the invisible becomes visible, so in dying, the visible becomes invisible. Life continues on another plane when the body has outlived its usefulness. Now, the body only outlives its usefulness because we have believed that, and it's built into our culture. So most folks who are in the New Thought movement tend to not age very rapidly. They tend to go on for longer than anticipated, doing far more than ever expected, because we know there's eternal life flowing in us, moving through us, guiding us and supporting us every minute of every day. Yes. And we also know that who we are was here from before Abraham, I am, into the all that is of the future, I am, again, as Jesus taught in the New Testament, which gets us to the 10th core concept, the Christ. The Christ is not a person, but a principle, a universal presence, the universal image of God that is present in all creation. This is the concept of the cosmic Christ, present in every person. Now that term, cosmic Christ, came out when Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Catholic priest and a paleontologist, published some of his works saying that we are destined as a species to become the cosmic Christ. And what's very interesting is that is totally supported by that book that Ernest Holmes grew up with. We are, as individuals and as all beingness, destined to become that which we have called Christ on a cosmic basis. So he says each human individual partakes of the Christ nature to the degree that he or she recognizes the cosmic Christ within and lives out of that revelation. Jesus of Nazareth was a human individual who revealed the Christ nature to the highest degree ever known. And that is what Emma Hopkins teaches in lesson 1. And many, many, many other teachers and avatars have said over the many millennia that these concepts have been available to us. So those are the 10 core concepts that he presented in The Science of Mind. And then he proceeded to provide some tools and methods and approaches for dealing with those. And he also provided a credo, because when you create a church, well, the IRS, the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, requires that there be a doctrine and a credo, a creed, something that people can say, I believe. So we're going to work through what Ernest Holmes considered our credo could be. And he says it all in the first person. So I'm going to read not every word, but I'm going to encourage you to think of this in the first person as I do read parts of it, okay? So the very, very, very first step in the beliefs that are the creed of the science of mind, religious tradition, religious science. I believe in God, the living Spirit, Almighty, one, indestructible, absolute, and self-existent cause. This one manifests itself in and through all creation. There's more, but that is sufficient. In the second point, in the second statement of the Creed, I believe in the incarnation of the Spirit, that same living Spirit, in all, and that we are all incarnations of the one Spirit. I believe in the eternality, the immortality, the continuity of the individual soul. Now, if you have been tracking at all what is now called near-death experiences, there are thousands of them on the internet right now that you can listen to. The continuity of the individual soul is got to be so evident. You cannot deny that anymore. And I know many materialist biologists and physicians who have had to give up their attachment to the notion that we are stuck and that the body just goes through some chemical and biological hallucination and processes. I'm sorry, but when you've been flatlined for 30 minutes and you can come back with weeks worth of information, it doesn't wash. And when we get a neurophysiologist or a neurosurgeon going through this and understanding it, that began the turnaround. So the continuity, the individual soul forever and ever expanding. And then in the next statement, he again is quoting what Jesus said in the New Testament. I believe that heaven is within me, and I experience it to the degree that I become conscious of it. I have to become aware of it in order to experience it. Yes? In the next slide, we get another set of the beliefs in the credo, in the creed. I believe the ultimate goal of life to be a complete emancipation from all discord. When I was growing up, my grandmother, who was not a religious scientist or a Christian scientist, she was a Methodist by training and a Hindu by experience. She used to say that our purpose in life was to become that Christ being that Jesus was. Well, isn't that the same thing? Or the Buddha saying that the first noble truth is we are born into what Americans and Englishmen have translated as suffering, but is actually literally dissatisfaction. We are intended, the path and the noble truths of the Buddhism are designed to emancipate us from all of that. My mind. Well, if any of you have studied with me, you know that if I am coughing, there's words that aren't being said. So I need to look inside and find those. There are many teachers who tell us that the perfect purpose of life is love. And that's accurate. If you see love as the experience of the all good leading to full emancipation from any form of dissatisfaction and distress. We'll go with that. His next point is, I believe in the unity of all life and that the highest God and the innermost God is one God. Straight out of the New Testament, the highest God. And also straight out of the Quran, which is lovely. The third point, I believe that God is personal to all who feel this indwelling presence. And it doesn't matter what you call it. Some of us have been taught to call that indwelling presence the Christ. Some of us have been taught to call that indwelling presence Jesus or Mother Mary. Emma Hopkins taught us to call it Emmanuel, God with us. Yes, Emmanuel. And that comes from the Hebrew. So whatever name, when Gandhi was on the planet, he called it Ram. If you followed Satguru on the internet, he calls it Shiva. any name. It doesn't matter. It's the indwelling presence. I believe in the direct revelation of truth through my intuitive and spiritual nature. Yes, and that is a huge part of what Science of Mind is about, yes? On the next one, I believe in the universal, or that the universal spirit, which is God, operates through a universal mind, which is the law of God. Mind and law and God are all one thing in the New Thought tradition. You can't separate them. So if you're thinking mind, you're thinking of an unchanging principle, which we call law. If you're thinking God, you're thinking of an unchanging mind, the infinite mind, or the universal spirit. Doesn't matter. They're all the same thing. And that's out of the Fillmore idea. All right? That I am surrounded by this creative mind, which receives the direct impress of my thought and actions upon it. Straight out of Troward, the direct impress of my conscious thoughts and unconscious thoughts are being felt by this infinite field of mind in which we are dwelling. The second point on that page, I believe in the healing of the sick through the power of the mind. And remember, that was what drove him into this whole experience. I believe in the control of conditions through the power of the mind. And this is the great mind. As I impress my thoughts on the infinite mind, I am able to heal the sick and control conditions. He says, I believe in the eternal goodness, the eternal loving kindness, and the eternal givingness of life to all. And I believe in my own soul, my own spirit, and my own destiny. For I believe, I understand that the life I live is God. In the next slide, we see what he did to get these words out. He was training practitioners. He was training ministers. He was having them come into the Institute. He was training teachers to teach them. And he was also writing a correspondence course. And I have actually been able to see these huge notebooks of lesson after lesson, hand-typed and then signed by Ernest Holmes, correspondence courses. Then he went on TV through the 50s. He was on several years. He had a weekly 30-minute broadcast in which he would share some little bit of reading and do a talk. And then once a year, he would head out to Northern California, or the Central California coast, actually, a few hours north of Los Angeles, to what is now a state park called Asilomar. And he would invite everybody who'd ever studied with him or was ever interested in what he was doing. And everyone would pay their own way. And they would all spend 3 glorious days immersed in the teachings that he had developed out of this understanding. And at the end of the day, he would meet in the great hall there, which is a really lovely space. And he would share what he had absorbed during the day. And then that monthly magazine was published, and it went out, and it still goes out. And people still include articles from Ernest Holmes in this monthly magazine, The Science of Mind. So Ernest, big difference, big ideas, started very young. And there's so many good stories I could share with you, but we're running out of time. Well, I'll share one. One is, he had all these Hollywood people coming to visit in that marvelous house that he and Hazel were living in. And he would take them on tours around his garden. And on one of these tours, he was showing them a rose. And it was a very old rose that had a very long, thick thorns on it. And one gashed his arm. And everyone went, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Oh, nothing." And he grabbed the handkerchief out of his pocket, wrapped around, continued with the tour. And they went back into the house and they had dinner. And while they were having dinner, someone said, "Well, how is your arm?" And he unwrapped it and it was healed. And there you have Ernest Holmes. Blessings, my dears. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.